So, welcome today to the Wild Sarasota Population. This month we are talking about heron and crane species of Florida. If you joined us last month, we did a presentation on some of the white wading birds, which are called egrets usually. And so today we will talk about herons and cranes, but we'll also compare and contrast a little bit with the egret species too, in case you're trying to differentiate between all these different species of amazing wading birds here in Florida. So I am Dr. Catherine Clements. I'm the Ecology and Natural Resources Educator for the University of Florida IFAS Extension Office in Sarasota County. And I provide education for youth and adults and assist our community with things about wildlife and native and invasive species, as well as the health benefits of nature and doing in-person guided walks at many of our county parks and preserves. I have a background in environmental education and a degree in environmental studies from State University of New York in Buffalo. And then I also spent about 15 years studying to be a physician and practicing as a physician before I came to full circle with accepting this position and being back in the environmental education field about 5 years ago. I also had an amazing opportunity to live in a state park here in Florida, the Oscar Scherer State Park, for over 15 years with my husband, who at the time was a park manager there. We brought up our 2 kids in the park, and we had various domestic and wild animals that joined our family throughout the years. So that was a very fun experience and kept my feet in the waters of the environment, even when I was working as a physician. So for those of you that may not know much about extension offices, we are a partnership between the county that we're in, the University of Florida, and the USDA. And there's actually an extension office associated with all 67 counties in the state of Florida, as well as extension offices throughout our country, because it is part of the land grant university's mission to extend the research being done at the university to address local needs by providing practical education. And through that, we help our residents, professionals, decision makers, and others build a better future for our community. So you'll see here on the screen our 6 core areas of programming at Sarasota County Extension. All of the extension offices are different because they're designed to meet the needs of their local community. And we actually have quite a large extension office with many, many different agents and programs to provide assistance to our community. So if you need help in any of these areas, have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us or continue to take some of the amazing classes that all of us offer through our extension. These are some of the programs that we offer through Sarasota County Extension. Often, in fact, I'm pretty sure, seeing some of the names, that we have some master gardeners on the line today. So they are an amazing group of volunteers, and we have a few hundred of them that volunteer to help the public with gardening here in Florida through our Sarasota County Extension. And then in the upper right-hand corner is the Florida Master Naturalist program. That's a program I'm heavily involved in. We teach all 10 of the Florida Master Naturalist classes out of our extension office throughout the year, or over a couple years, because that's a lot of classes, and they're 24 to 40-hour classes, adult education about Florida's ecosystem. So if you want to know more about the state around you here in Florida, that's a great set of courses to take. You can take one of them or all of them, and you can take them in any order and really at any location that offers them in Florida. All right, so let's jump right into our topic today. I'm probably going to spend about an hour, maybe less, we'll see, talking to you about herons and cranes, and then there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. So we're going to talk today about what's the difference between egrets, herons, and cranes. So that's going to be a couple slides that are a little bit of a repeat from the last presentation because they're still relevant. And then we're going to cover 6 species of herons and 2 species of cranes that are found here in Florida. So there's a wonderful article by Ken Kaufman, who's the field editor for Audubon. And he talks about how there's not really much biological or therefore taxonomic difference between egrets, herons, or cranes. You know, some of this taxonomy was determined way before we had genetic studies or could really look at some of the finer details of the anatomy of these birds. So sometimes things were grouped taxonomically based on how they looked, their characteristics, and or their behavior as well. And so, for instance, great egrets are more closely related to the great blue heron than to other egrets. And you see a great egret on the screen there. Snowy and reddish egrets are actually in the same genus, which means they're more closely related to the little blue and tricolored heron than they are to other egrets. And then the cattle egret is in a separate genus all by itself. So egrets are often a name used for white feathered wading birds, and herons are often used to refer to more of our darker feathered friends. But once again, there are many exceptions. There's not really a rule. Egrets and herons, along with bitterns, are in the same order. So order is pretty high up in taxonomy, and it's the order Pelecaniformis, which are, of course, pelicans and related species. Egrets and herons and also bitterns are in the same family as well, meaning their family sort of comes below order, so you're even more closely related when you're in the same family. So they're in the same order as pelicans, but in a different family from pelicans. And that family, the Ardeidae, has almost 70 species worldwide. So this family are large, long-legged birds that wade and hunt at the water's edge. Yet, once again, no rules, right? Some subgroups seem distinct. The bitterns, which we're not even going to talk about in this presentation, are solitary marsh dwellers, and they have a very noticeable call. And then night herons, which we will talk about today, are most active at night when most of the other herons are roosting. So you sort of just have to learn what they're called because there isn't really a rule one way or the other. So when we talk about cranes, it gets perhaps a little bit more confusing, although I think cranes look more distinct from egrets and herons than egrets and herons look from each other. So I think cranes are a little bit easier to identify. They're also our largest wading birds. But they, from a taxonomic perspective, they are separated out from the herons and the others on the basis of internal details, like the structure of the skeleton. And then our most recent genetic studies have confirmed that they should sort of be in a separate taxonomical category. So they're in a different order, which I can't say very well, but I believe it's called order Gruiformis. And these are wading and terrestrial birds that traditionally didn't fall into any other order. So they're sort of just dumped into this order if they didn't match up with any other places. And so also in that order are birds like rails and the limpkin. And so, like with many things, and those of you that are plant people, you know this well too, you know, biologists, taxonomists, molecular geneticists, in the bird world, ornithologists, all of this sort of grouping things together based on shared characteristics is always under discussion, and changes along with names change for these species quite often, actually. But here are some of the differences between cranes and herons. Cranes are omnivorous, so they eat both plant material and small animals, while herons are going to be mostly carnivorous. Cranes have loud bugling calls, which if you have some Sandhill cranes around you, you know what their call sounds like. It's very distinct, while herons tend to have sort of short barking calls or harsh squawks. Cranes will typically nest on the ground, while most herons nest in trees or taller marsh vegetation. And herons will often nest in dense colonies, depending on the species, but then they will often feed as solitary individuals. And with cranes, it's swapped. cranes will often spread out to nest in their isolated mating pairs, but then they will flock together, sometimes in really large flocks, in order to forage for food. All right, so let's go right into talking about our herons. I'm going to start with our smallest heron here in Florida, and then there's 4 herons that are relatively the same size, although they look different from each other. And then we will talk about our great blue heron, which is our largest heron. So we'll talk about our 6 herons, and then we'll talk about our 2 cranes. So this is the green heron. I love these. I just think they're so beautiful. And they also are just, relatively tiny compared to the other herons. They're sometimes hard to see because they'll often be in amongst denser vegetation. Although here in Sarasota, honestly, a great place to see them is down by the marina at Marina Jacks, where there'll be a lot of green herons sitting on the ropes that are the mooring ropes between the boats and the dock. So they'll hang out there looking for an easy meal. So that's a great place to see them if you haven't seen them before and you want an easy location. So green herons are found year-round here in Florida and on the California coast, Central America, and the northern part of South America. They nest in coastal and inland wetlands with trees and shrubs, and they like those secluded nesting sites. So I tried to give you the oldest bird on record for each of these species. And most of this information in this presentation today is from Cornell Labs All About Birds website. It's a fabulous website to go to, especially if you want to learn how to identify birds or listen to their calls or get fun facts, because they have it all. So they indicated that the oldest green heron on record was about 7 years, 11 months old. It was banded in Oklahoma in 1971 and then found in Mexico almost 8 years later. They're about 16 to 18 inches tall, and they tend to sort of squat their heads down so that you don't really see their necks. So they don't even usually look that tall. They weigh about 8.5 ounces. Of course, birds have hollow bones that aid in their flight. So 8.5 ounces is not very much, but a decent size for a bird. And they have a wingspan of 2 feet. Their populations have been indicated to be declining, but they are not a listed species. So here's a great photo because you can see this one stretching out its neck as it's perhaps drinking or looking for food. And so generally they're pretty stocky. As I mentioned, they sort of hunch up. It's almost like if it was us, we'd be drawing our chin to our chest and bringing our shoulders up and hunching up so that you don't see their neck very well, unless they're purposely stretching it out like this one is. They are a beautiful color. They tend from a distance to look very dark, but when you look at them close up, you can see sort of that velvety green back and head. They have sort of a rusty purplish chestnut colored body. And then that green on their head often looks very dark. And they do have a short crest that you don't always see because often those crest feathers are just sort of flat against their head. The juveniles are browner and they have a lot of pale streaking on the neck and spots on their wings. And these green herons, they'll hunt throughout the day and the night. They just like to be around thick vegetation, and they like to be in water or around water that's pretty shallow. And of course, they're smaller, so they're going to often want to be hunting in water that's more shallow than the larger herons will hunt in. They're going to eat mainly small fish, but also some small insects and spiders, tiny crabs, snails, amphibians like tiny frogs or tadpoles, reptiles, and rodents. They will wait very patiently, so you'll often just sort of see them sitting and waiting. And then they'll surprise a fish and snatch it with their very sharp bill. And what's really cool about green herons that's different from most birds, including the other herons, is that they do use tools. They'll use little twigs or even a feather or insects, as bait, and they'll drop them in the water to try to lure fish, and then they'll grab the fish when the fish come over to look. And then also sort of interesting and unusual is that they will occasionally dive into deeper water and then swim back to shore. And although some of our birds like cormorants and anhingas do that as their traditional way to catch food, most herons are not going to do that other than the green heron. All of these birds tend to just pair monogamously. Some will pair monogamously for life. Some will pair monogamously just for the breeding season. So green herons are the same. They will pair up with a single mate. All of our herons and cranes have really interesting courtship displays. So the green heron will stretch their necks, they'll snap their bills, they'll fly with big exaggerated flaps like, "Here I am, come see me," and they'll call really loudly. They tend to be solitary nesters, but can occasionally join larger colonies of nesting birds. They are defensive of their breeding and feeding areas, and they will defend from each other, as well as predatory birds like crows and grackles. They have 3 to 5 pale green to bluish eggs once or twice a year, so they may have 2 broods. And for this species, both the male and female will take care of the chicks, and the chicks stay with their parents somewhere upwards of a month after leaving the nest as they're being taught to forage. All right, next in line is our tricolored heron. And these are 23.5 to about 27.5 inches tall. They weigh almost twice as much as a green heron at 14.6 ounces, and they have a wingspan of 3 feet. So definitely a size difference. And these were previously known as Louisiana herons. So back when I first did my environmental degree, they were called Louisiana herons, and they were just making that switch and renaming them, at least their common name. And these guys are year-round along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, off the Atlantic coast, and also down into the coast of Central America and the top of the coast of South America. They like coastal estuaries, salt marshes, mangroves, and lagoons. And the oldest recorded tricolored heron was almost 18 years old. And that one had been banded in Virginia in 1958 and then was found shot in the Bahamas in 1976. And sometimes these birds, unfortunately, are still illegally hunted. Obviously, there's much less of that with the protections that all birds have now federally in our country. But these birds often will be around fisheries and take fish, and so in the past had been hunted because of that. It's a medium-sized heron. It's very slim and relatively delicate with that long neck and a small head. It's larger than a snowy egret, and I think I have some pictures for you to compare in just a second, but it's smaller than a great blue heron. They're bluish gray. They have some lavender on them. They even can have, like this one you can see has a little bit of rusty feathers on its back. But really what's going to distinguish this bird is that white stripe down the front of its neck and its white belly. So you can really see like its whole belly is white, and that is very different from other dark herons. And then it has yellow legs. They are very active in their foraging style, so they will forage more similar to reddish egrets, which both the tricolored heron and the reddish egret will sort of dance around. They'll hold up their wings to provide shade for fish to potentially come under. So they're very active in their foraging style, whereas some of our other herons are more sort of steadfast and stately and just stand there and patiently wait for the food to come to them. So that's how you might distinguish a little blue heron too. When it is in breeding plumage, so many of these herons will have a particular breeding plumage. This one is showing its white plumes extending from the back of its head, and then we're not really seeing it here, but the base of the bill can turn bright blue and the legs will turn pink. So they're much more colorful during breeding. Juveniles will have a reddish neck and reddish feathers along their backs and wings. They fly like most of the herons with their head drawn in and their feet trailing behind. So they'll pull their head in like an S-shaped curve. And that's one of the ways you can tell the larger herons or egrets from a crane. A crane is going to fly with its neck straight out. Our tricolored herons use the coastal waters and wade in search of small fish. And once again, often sort of dancing around looking for their food. They also, before they strike their food, will pull their neck in and sort of bend down and crouch so that their belly almost touches the water. They have really interesting foraging styles. It's really neat to watch a tricolored heron search for and catch its prey. They build stick nests in trees and shrubs. They will be in colonies with other wading birds and typically on island rookeries. Their nests are at least 13 feet above ground level, whereas great blue herons, for instance, will nest way even higher. They may nest at the same height. It just depends on what's available for them to build their nests on. But typically our tricolored herons will be sort of 13 feet above the ground, whereas great blue herons might be as high as like 100 feet above the ground. They also are monogamous for a single breeding season, and they will greet each other at the nest by offering each other a twig, which a number of the heron species do that. Also 3 to 5 bluish-green eggs once a year. And our tricolored herons are currently state designated as threatened, and this is mostly habitat loss from the loss and degradation of wetland habitats in our state, including obviously in the Everglades. It's just such a beautiful bird. I just love these. So often people get confused between our tricolored heron here and our little blue heron here because they're almost exactly the same size. The little blue heron has a little bit more variability in size. They can be a little bit smaller and a little bit larger than the tricolored, but they completely overlap in terms of sizing. And they're also, the majority of both of their bodies are bluish, purplish. So until you get used to seeing them or know the cues that allow you to determine which is which, that sometimes can be confusing. So once again, here's our tricolored heron. And in our tricolored heron, we're really, the main feature we're looking for is that white stripe on the neck and the white belly. Whereas here with the little blue heron, you see that they are completely a solid grayish blue color, maybe with some purplish too. What gets tricky is when we talk about the immature plumage of the little blue heron. So I'll talk about that in just a minute, because then that adds a whole nother layer of trickiness to identification. But for our adults, if you look for that white belly and the white streak on the neck, then you're looking at a tricolored heron. So our little blues are found in the United States from Missouri, east to Virginia, down to Florida, and west to Texas. In peninsular Florida, they are relatively common, but they are less common in the Panhandle. They're also found in Cuba and along both coasts of Mexico and Central America and down into South America as well. So they like quiet waters of tidal flats and estuaries. They also like streams and swamps and flooded fields. So both sort of brackish water as well as fresh water. They will forage around other species of wading birds. They like water about 2 to 6 inches deep, so they can be a little bit deeper than those green herons like. And they often will be found in densely vegetated areas like the green herons. They eat mostly small fish, but they'll eat small frogs, crabs, and other crustaceans. They'll even eat some insects like grasshoppers and dragonflies and other invertebrates. The oldest little blue heron was almost 14 years old, banded in Virginia in 1957 and found later in Maryland. So again, another small to medium heron. They also have a pretty thin body. Their body shape is pretty similar to the tricolored heron, but they are very dark all over. Their head can look sort of purplish. You can see in this one, there's a little bit of variety. Sometimes they look, depending on the lighting and how close you are to them, they might look just completely slate gray blue. And sometimes the purplish of their head and neck is a little bit more obvious. They have yellow eyes, they have greenish legs, and they have a pale blue bill at the base, but then it's black at the tip. So if you look closely at this one, you can see that change in color. You've got the base of the bill is really pale and then darker at the tip. Let's go back to this one. Just because the angle and the lighting aren't great, it's not as obvious here, but you still see pale bill here and then a darker tip. Whereas with our tricolored heron, it does not do that. You've got more of like a black bill on top and yellowish along the bottom. So let's talk about the juvenile plumage of the little blue heron. This is where it gets tricky. So juveniles are entirely white. If you go to that All About Birds website, you'll be able to see one of the photos of a juvenile, and they are entirely white. They might have some vague dusky tips at the outer primary wing feathers, but they pretty much look like they're entirely white. So we think maybe this is an adaptation survival strategy that allows them to be better accepted by other white birds like white herons and egrets. And that allows them some increased protection when they're young and the ability to catch more fish when they're around those other birds. But it makes them difficult to tell apart from some of those other birds. So some of the other white birds that may look a little bit like a juvenile little blue heron would be some of our egrets. So I think I have some pictures to show you in a minute, as well as ibis. But remember that your ibis are going to have a very curved beak, and their beak is going to be like an orangish, reddish pink. So ibises you can tell apart from because they have that curved beak. And then what's really interesting when you see these start to get their adult plumage in, they're all patchy, they're all white and blue. So then sometimes you're thinking, what kind of bird is this and what happened to it? But once you know that that's a juvenile little blue heron, it's pretty easy to pick them out. And sometimes we call that coloration calico or piebald. So let's compare some of the traits of the little blue heron to some of these other birds. So we talked about the adult little blue heron having a dual colored beak. And so here's a reddish egret. Now they're going to be bigger than a little blue heron. They're going to be more rusty colored on their head and neck as opposed to that slate gray, bluish, or purplish color. And their bill to me is more obviously two colors because it's very pink at the base and very black at the tip. Whereas this one's a little bit more like it's lightish gray and then blackish. So that's those two birds to differentiate. And then here's a snowy egret, which you might want to differentiate from a juvenile little blue heron. And our snowy egret, one of the best ways to identify them is they have this bright yellow patch at the base of their bill by their eye. And then they also have black legs with yellow feet. So this is a great way to identify snowy egrets, not only from immature little blue herons, but also from other egrets. And then I stuck a cattle egret in here too. Cattle egrets are not as likely to be in the same habitat as little blue herons. So you're less likely to see them in the same places and confuse a juvenile little blue heron with a cattle egret, but they can have some overlap. So I threw this one in anyways. Our cattle egrets, though, are generally going to be in agricultural fields or in cattle fields. They like to follow behind tractors and cattle as they stir up insects because they're mostly insectivorous. And they're going to be white, but they're going to have some of this rusty colored feathers on their heads and back, which also become more noticeable during breeding season. So those are some of our birds that we might differentiate from a little blue heron. And a little bit more about the little blue heron. Here you can really see this one might be going into breeding plumage because the base of its bill is really sort of bright blue as well. So they are very noisy breeders. They will nest in colonies with lots of other species of birds. So these rookeries can get really, really noisy. If you've ever been to one, you can attest to that. Little blues may chase and attack each other. They'll defend their food and their nesting territory. They'll strike and jab at each other with their bills. They will have 3 to 4 pale bluish green eggs. So pretty much all of your heron eggs are going to be like a pale bluish green. And then for little blue herons, their older chicks may actually attack and sometimes kill their younger siblings, especially in difficult years where there might not be enough food. And if they get rid of those smaller siblings, then they are going to have more food for themselves. So it is sort of a survival strategy. Better that some of the young survive than none at all because nobody got enough food. And this is known as siblicide. There's a beautiful picture of one. I love this picture. They have a built-in row of teeth along their middle toe, which some of the other wading birds have as well. And they use this as a grooming comb. And this is one of the species that was actually not decimated during the plume trade back in the 1900s. So in the we talked about this in last month's presentation, if you visited us for that. We talked a lot about the plume trade and how many of our herons and egrets, especially their breeding plumage and their long egret feathers, which are like those long feathers on the back of their head, were taken through hunting for women's hats. And it was high fashion in the 1900s to have sometimes even entire birds on your hat. And so our egrets especially, but also some of our heron species were almost hunted to extinction for that fashion. And it actually was what brought upon the founding of the Audubon Society. But little blue herons don't have those egret plumes, so their numbers were actually saved during that time. But they have been declining. They've declined by about 55% between 1966 and 2015, according to the North American Breeding Bird Survey. And they are listed here in Florida as a state threatened species. So, you know, pretty much all of our water birds are vulnerable to changes in water quality, both as we lose habitat when wetlands are developed, but also as we contaminate the remaining water in wetlands too. Also, human disturbance has been shown to cause adults to abandon nests. So, you know, whenever we disturb any type of animal, it causes them stress. It causes them to utilize energy that they may not have. When they're under stress, they sometimes will leave their eggs or babies or not feed them. Sometimes animals won't mate when they're stressed or won't feed themselves appropriately either. So remembering always to keep your distance. I know I love to do photography out in nature, but I always have to remind myself it's not about the photograph, it's about keeping those animals safe and keeping the environment safe for those animals and trying to maintain that space. All right, so now we're going to talk about our 2 night herons, also sort of about the same size as our tricolored and little blue heron, but they look really different because our night herons tend to be stockier and also tend to like pull their head in a little bit like the green heron does. So the black-crowned night heron is found in fresh, salt, and brackish wetlands, and it's actually the most widespread heron in the world. They're about the same height as the little blue and the tricolored at about 23 to 26 inches tall. They have a slightly larger wingspan though, almost 4 feet of wingspan. So they're sort of short and stocky with a really wide wingspan. They eat all sorts of things, terrestrial, freshwater, and marine animals. They'll eat leeches and worms, other insects, crayfish, bivalves, fish, frogs, lizards, snakes, rodents, birds, eggs. They'll eat all sorts of things. They'll even eat dead things. They'll eat some vegetation, and sometimes you'll even find them around dumpsters or landfills because they'll also eat garbage too. And they will use their bills to grab their prey instead of spearing it like some of the other egrets and herons do. They have an amazing red eye, and they have very contrasting plumage. They have a black cap and a black back. And so that's one of the ways to tell them apart from the yellow-crowned night heron that we'll look at in a minute. So our black crown, you're just going to remember that they have that black cap and black back. And then the rest of their coloration is mostly like a whitish to light gray. They also will have long white head plumes, but you don't always see those. Sometimes they're laid down flat against the neck. When they're flying, their legs barely reach past the end of their tail, which I think I have a picture of coming up. So their legs are a little bit shorter, and so they're going to look a little bit different in flight. And then their immature plumage looks very different. I do have a picture. Yep, there's the immatures. So very speckled, mottled, brown and white. And their eye color is different when they're immature as well. And their bill color also a little bit different. They're most active at night or at dusk, hence their name night heron. And you'll often see them leaving at dusk from their daytime roost to go and forage. So there's the immatures. They are social birds that like to roost together, and they will breed in colonies. And like most of our herons, they build their nests out of sticks, but they like to build out over the water. Both of the mates will vigorously defend their feeding and nesting territories and will strike with their bills and grab other individuals' bills or wings. We think they're monogamous. And there's that 3 to 5 bluish-green eggs. What's interesting about the black-crowned night heron is they will actually brood any chick that is placed in its nest. They don't seem to distinguish from their own chicks and other birds' chicks. So sort of interesting. And the juveniles will leave the nest at about a month, but they can't fly for 6 weeks. So they spend a couple more weeks just moving on foot through vegetation and joining up with foraging flocks at night. Okay, so here's our yellow-crowned night heron. So when you see them one right after another, they're a little bit easier to tell apart. So here's our black-crowned night heron. It's got that whitish body with some gray feathers on its wings, and it's got that really noticeable black cap and back. And you can, on this one, you can really see that white plume in the back as well. Whereas our yellow-crowned night heron, to me, they look a little bit taller and less stockier. They don't pull their necks in as much or as often as the black-crowned night heron does, but they also are more overall sort of grayish throughout their bodies. And they do have a black cap, but they have, and we'll see it better in another picture, but they have a little bit of yellowish featheration here, hence their name yellow-crowned night heron. Sometimes that only looks white. It doesn't always look obviously yellow, but they'll have light feathers here. Then they have the black feathers. Then they have sort of this white mustache and then black underneath by their chin. So different heads for sure if you look. So our yellow-crowned night heron is year-round in coastal regions here in Florida, as well as in Central America and Northern South America. They like to be where there are crabs and crustaceans to eat year-round. They can be common in coastal marshes, barrier islands, and mangroves, and as far as the Midwest, and even found in Michigan and Ontario. So those are going to migrate, but they're found year-round here in Florida where there's food availability year-round. They're about the same size, 22 to 26 inches. They also have a wingspan of almost 4 feet. Oh, and here's an interesting fact that they show up in the fossil record with the earliest recorded fossil about 2 to 2.5 million years ago, and that was actually from here in Sarasota, Florida. And the oldest yellow-crowned night heron on record was only about 6 years old, banded originally in Mexico in 1974. And they might live to older, but that's the one that we actually have information about, and that's how old that oldest one on record was. They will forage both during the day and at night. So our black-crowned night heron is the one that's going to more commonly forage mostly at dusk and at night, whereas our yellow-crowned will be out during the day as well. Because for them, it's really about when high tide is. And most of their foraging is going to happen on 3 hours on either side of high tide. And as mentioned in the last slide, they really like mostly crabs and crustaceans, but they'll eat all sorts of other things, just like the black-crowned night heron will. They stand still or walk slowly along the water's edge when they're looking for food, and they tend to stay away from others. They will lunge at prey with their bills, and if the prey is small enough, they'll swallow it whole. But if it's a large crab, they'll either grab it by its claw or impale it and then shake it into pieces and swallow the individual pieces. Super cool to see that when that happens. A great place to see yellow-crowned night herons, where I've seen the most of them, is down in Sandhill in the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge there. And I remember there was one time that I was biking. There's like a loop trail that you can drive in your car, or you can walk it, or you can bike it. And I was biking that loop trail early in the morning, and I felt like all I saw was yellow-crowned night herons. There were so many of them. There were a ton of immatures at that time of the year that I was there as well. I think it was in the middle of the summer. And yet they were all separated from each other. They were all along the drive in different places by the water, but they weren't really together in any one place. They were just each individually separate along the way. So once again, gray birds with that obvious facial pattern. Here you see the yellow or whitish cap a lot better than we did in that first picture. So you sort of see how you would differentiate this from the black-crowned night heron, because you've got yellowish white, black, white, and then black. So a lot more obvious. Let's see, they have a black bill and orange yellow legs that become brighter as they transition into adulthood. The immatures are very similar to the immature black-crowned night heron in that they're very brown and white mottled. They take 3 to 4 years to develop into their adult plumage. And as I mentioned, our black-crowned night herons have slightly shorter legs. They have that lighter white belly and that distinct black head and back. So that's how you're going to tell them apart from each other. Yellow-crowned night herons, once again, will make a stick nest, but they like to break dead, brittle twigs and branches directly from standing vegetation. And in some colonies, they'll actually strip the trees of all their twigs and smaller branches. And they will steal twigs from other birds' nests as well. They'll nest close together, but they'll also defend their site from other birds and intruders. And the older young may also sort of be mean to their younger siblings and even push them out of the nest. And they have 2 to 6 pale bluish green eggs. So now we're going to talk about our largest heron. So this is our great blue heron. I just thought this was a beautiful picture. You can see it's caught a fish here. It's also sort of ruffling out some of its plumage. So just a really lovely picture. They are year-round residents through most of our country, except for some of the more mountainous regions, and they're found in both saltwater and freshwater habitats. They will also forage in grasslands and agricultural fields. So these are our largest heron. They are anywhere from 38 to upwards of 54 inches tall. So anywhere from like 3 to 4.5 feet tall. They weigh 74 to 82 ounces, so also a lot heavier than the previous birds we talked about, and they can have a wingspan of around 5.5 to 6.5 feet. The oldest recorded great blue heron was 24.5 years old. Pretty amazing. Here is one in flight. You can see how its long legs extend way beyond its tail feathers. This one has its neck somewhat stretched out, but they often bring their neck all the way in that S shape when they are flying. So more often you're going to see them with their neck brought in even more in flight. They're grayish blue. They do have a black crown on their head and head plumes. They have a very long neck and long legs and a thick yellow bill. And as we saw in the previous picture, their head, chest, and wing plumes often have a very shaggy appearance. The juveniles will have a sort of a more dusky grayish colored bill, and feathers will be gray and brownish without that contrast of the white and black stripe on their head. They develop that later on, so their head will look a little bit more monochrome and sort of grayish. There is a white form, so of course here's more of the confusion. And the white form is sometimes referred to as the great white heron, which gets confusing with the great egret. But the white form of the heron is found really in the marine areas of southern Florida, the Yucatan Peninsula, and in the Caribbean. So not a very large range. So if you're up in this part of Florida or further north in Florida or elsewhere in our country, you're and you see a large white wading bird, it's probably a great egret. There's also an intermediate version that has the body of the great blue heron with the white head and neck of the great white heron. So even more confusing. So I don't see great white herons very often because I don't go to South Florida very often, and I don't think I've ever seen the intermediate version. So unless you're in the area where they're found, it's going to be pretty rare that you would see one. So those feathers that we saw in the first picture that are sort of frayed, those are specialized feathers that continually grow and fray. And the herons will actually basically use that fringe claw on their middle toe to comb those feathers and get some of that down. And they use that to sort of clean themselves and remove fish slime and other oils while they're preening. They are one of the stately hunters, so they stand very silently. They'll wade up to belly deep, and they will move very, very quietly and slowly looking for their prey. Yet when they see their prey, they will strike really quickly. They actually have a high number of what's called rod photoreceptors in their eyes. So we have rod type photoreceptors as well, but we don't have as many in our in the back of our eyes as we do cone type receptors. So the more rod type receptors you have, the more able you are to see at night. So they do have a number of rod receptors that allow them to hunt better at night. And they eat all sorts of things. And they will either grab their prey with their bill, or they will spear, especially larger fish with their bill, and then they'll shake them to either break off the pointy sharp spines on the fish, or allow those sharp spines to sort of relax against the fish's body so that then they can swallow the fish whole without being poked by those spines. They live in breeding colonies, often referred to as heronries, that are within 2 to 4 miles of where they're going to forage. And their colonies can consist of 500 or more nests that are often 100 feet or more above the ground, with multiple nests per tree. So really an amazing sight to see one of these large heronries. The males will arrive at the colony and choose the nest sites, and then they'll court the passing females. And like many of the herons, they have elaborate courtship and pair bonding displays. They'll have a greeting, they'll transfer sticks, they'll relieve each other at the nest with like sort of shaking up and erecting their plumes and clapping their bill tips. They're mostly monogamous, but they may choose new partners each breeding season. All right, so we're down to our last 2 species we're going to talk about. These are our crane species. If you're joining us from here in Sarasota, you've probably seen many of these because we have many of them that are not only in our natural areas, but also around our neighborhoods, in some of our more residential park settings, often walking along the side of the road or crossing the road, and people are having to stop their cars to let the birds cross the road. So you may be very familiar with these birds. They are similar in how they look in the coloration of their plumage across their range, but they have a variation in size between the subspecies that are in different parts of the country. So we have a lesser sandhill crane subspecies that breed in the Arctic, and they are the smallest birds. And we have 2 subspecies that occur here in Florida. One is a non-migratory Florida sandhill crane, and they're year-round residents. And we have a population of about 4,000 to 5,000 of those. And those are probably the ones that you are seeing if you're here in Sarasota. Whereas there's also a greater sandhill crane subspecies, and they breed in the Great Lakes and then migrate here to winter in Florida. And those are the largest ones. So our Florida non-migratory species are sort of the middle size of the sandhill crane subspecies. They're about 4 feet tall. They weigh anywhere from 120 to 173 ounces, and their wingspan is upwards of 6.5 feet. And they're pretty amazing and large when you see them close up. We have a couple by the office that we see sometimes, obviously, with their young, if it's that right time of the year, and they're just amazing. The oldest on record was 36 years and 7 months old. And these also have been found in the Sarasota fossil pit going back to 2.5 million years ago. There they are in flight. So you can see their flight is very different. They also have very long legs like a great blue heron that are going to stretch out way beyond their tail feathers, but they are going to keep their necks out straight. And they're going to be very white underneath when they're flying. And they're pretty much like a whitish gray bird with that crimson cap on their head. Legs and beak are long and black. And their bill is actually longer than their head. They often have rust-colored feathers. You can see a few of them here on this bird, and we'll see another picture coming up. Often on sort of their bodies, and it's often called a bustle because it looks like they sort of have a skirt of feathers on. The juveniles are going to be gray with more of that rusty brown on the head and back of neck. They won't have developed that full crimson cap yet. And they also don't have that pale cheek that we'll see. You can sort of see it here, but we'll see it better in an upcoming picture. Here, I just thought I'd insert a picture of a great egret, one of our other large white birds, but you can see their flight is different. They've got their neck pulled right into that type S shape. Also, great egrets are our largest egret. So they also have very long legs that stick out beyond their tail, but you're really looking at that neck to see that difference between a flying egret or heron and a crane. So here you can really see that white cheek patch that the adults will develop, as well as that crimson reddish color over their eye. Our Sandhill cranes are omnivorous. So remember, our cranes are omnivorous, whereas most of our heron species are mostly carnivorous. We talked about some of our herons eating some other things, but they're going to be mostly carnivorous, whereas our Sandhill cranes are going to be more clearly omnivorous and eating things like grains and seeds and berries, and then supplementing that with small invertebrates and sometimes maybe even a small vertebrate. And they're not going to hunt in open water. They're going to be looking for food, maybe along roads and in your yards, but also on prairies and grasslands and marshes. And they can form extremely large flocks in other areas of the country where there's a larger population that can be into the tens of thousands on their wintering grounds and during migration. And they also fly very high when they're migrating. They breed in open wetlands, fields, and prairies. So they actually will build their nest on the ground, often in water or like in a high point in the middle of a wetland. They have a loud, rolling, trumpeting sound, and it's a very unique call. So if you haven't heard it or you're not sure you've heard it, I suggest going to that All About Birds website and listening to the call because it's so unique. And once you've heard it, if there are Sandhill cranes around, then you will be able to recognize that call. Often I'll hear the call in the morning when they're moving around to find where they're going to forage for the day. But part of the reason cranes, both the Sandhill crane and the whooping crane, have such a unique, interesting call is that they have a really long trachea. So like our trachea just goes from the back of our throat to our stomach. Their trachea is very long. The whooping crane's trachea is basically as long as the bird is tall. And that extra amount is actually wrapped around beneath their sternum or that bone in their chest. And so that allows for a lot of like vibration and resonance and that deep tone and pitch that we hear, which is very distinctive to cranes. So there's one on its nest in a wetland. And cranes will do like a dancing courtship too. They will stretch their wings out. They'll bob their heads up and down, they'll bow to each other, and they'll leap into the air. It's really amazing to see. So if you haven't ever seen it out in nature, probably I would assume there's YouTube videos. You could Google it and watch because it's really neat to see. Their bonding will begin when they're around 2 years old, and they may mate when they're young, but they may just bond around that age and may not mate until they're as old as 7 years old. So it's a very strong bonding, and they mate for life. They don't just mate for a breeding season. So Sandhill cranes mate for life. They stay together year round, but if one of the pair dies, they will look for another mate. Their nests are large. They're about 2 feet in diameter and made from the vegetation that is dominant in the area where they choose to nest. They only have 1 to 3 eggs. So they're a larger bird than the herons we've talked about, but they tend to have less eggs. Usually it's 2 eggs, and then usually only one of the nestling birds will survive to adulthood. So here's a picture of them in their mating ritual. So you can just imagine, just even from this picture, how interesting and unique it is. And they're just such beautiful birds. So here's a picture of an adult with its young birds, and you can see somewhat of what they mean when they talk about a bustle, like all those feathers that look a little bit like there's a little extra skirt on the back of the bird. These young chicks can leave the nest within 8 hours of hatching, and they're even capable of swimming that early on. So they're quite capable when they're young, but they stay with their parents for about 10 months and then leave their parents when the next breeding season is coming around. Cranes will attack aerial predators, so birds coming at them from the air. They'll leap up into the air and kick their feet at those predatory birds, and they will spread their wings and hiss at any ground predator, any terrestrial predator. And of course, if you're a human being and you get too close to them, they will also potentially protect, especially if they have young. And they'll do this thing, which does seem very scary. They will spread their wings and hiss at you, and they're big birds. They may, even if they really feel threatened, they may even kick out as well. But generally, if you stay away from them, they are pretty comfortable, often around humans, even when they do have their young, and will walk amongst us in our vehicles. But I wouldn't directly go and approach them. They, of course, are also losing habitat because they are wetland birds. And that is some of the primary threat facing their population. So not only is their range diminishing because of the loss of habitat, so they are considered a state designated threatened species here in Florida. And our last bird today is the whooping crane. So whooping cranes are our largest wading bird, but they've had quite a difficult history. By 1941, there were only 21 of them left, and 15 of them were birds that migrated between Canada and Texas. And then the rest of the population, which would have been 6 of them, lived year-round in Louisiana. So that Louisiana population went extinct. 6 birds isn't a real viable population. I mean, 15 birds isn't either. So with some really great biology and conservation strategies, a population of about 600 today has been developed out of that 15 that were left in 1941. About 440 of that 600 number are in the wild, and about 160 are in captivity. And those were all descended from that population that was migrating between Canada and Texas. And there still is a self-sustaining population that does that migration. But there are also 3 reintroduced populations due to captive breeding programs. There's a non-migratory population here in Florida along the Lake Wales Ridge, and that was introduced by the FWC, our Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, in 1993. They sort of stopped that program in 2008 because they were having issues with reproduction and survival. And then we also have one of the 3 reintroduced populations is a migratory population. This is one that you've probably heard of or watched the movie about. So this is the migratory population that migrates between Wisconsin down to Florida in the winter, and they're trained to do that with an ultralight aircraft that trains the young cranes to migrate. And so that population also is in sort of central Florida as well as the northern peninsular part of Florida. So main threat to them is also alteration and degradation of their habitat, especially in the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas, where that self-sustaining population continues to spend their winter. Also, the wetlands where they breed in Canada are also undergoing alteration and degradation as well. And then because they have such a small range, you know, a natural disaster like a hurricane could potentially wipe out one of these populations. So that's a concern as well. They also have been killed by cars, like we sometimes see with the Sandhill cranes, and they've had increased predation by species such as bears and wolves, and up in Canada, wolverines, and even bald eagles may take the crane. Because they migrate so high up, wind farms can also be a problem if they come in contact with those. So these are, of all the birds we've talked about today, this is the one species that is actually federally designated as a listed species. And not only is it federally designated as a listed species, it is endangered, which is the highest category. It's above threatened, like we saw with a couple of our herons. So definitely a species of concern. The oldest one was a little over 28 years old. So tallest bird in North America. It has snowy white plumage. It has sort of a reddish cap and sort of that blackish chin or cheek there. They're upwards of 15 pounds, which is really quite hefty for a bird. And they have a wingspan of more than 7 feet and can be 5 feet tall or taller, which is as tall as many humans. So they're very imposing. They also have that long trachea. They are also omnivorous and eat anything from invertebrates to small vertebrates and vegetation. They, like sandhill cranes, will sort of peck and probe through ground and flooded soils to find underground prey. They also mate for life, but will pick new partners if they lose their partner. And they are not fertile until somewhere between 4 and 7 years of age. Both of them will build their nest together. They pile up and then trample down vegetation, and their nest can be anywhere from 2 to 5 feet across. So can be about the same size as a sandhill crane nest, all the way up to more than twice the size of a sandhill crane nest. They also have 1 to 3 eggs, and it's rare for more than one of the chicks to survive to adulthood. Small whooping cranes or juveniles have a cinnamon brown body color, but by 4 months they will start to gain their adult white feathers. And they fledge from 80 to 90 days. And the migratory ones become very independent once they are on their first migration. The non-migratory cranes become more independent right about like when the sandhill crane juveniles do, which is when their parents are getting ready for the next breeding season. So there they are in flight. And so that covers all of the birds we're going to talk about today. I welcome you to visit if you're down here in Sarasota County. We are lucky enough to have 2 local Audubon societies. We have the Sarasota Audubon Society up at Celery Fields. There's a nature center there, and over 247 bird species have been sighted at the Celery Fields. So it's an amazing place to go. People come from not only all over our country, but all over the world to bird at Celery Fields. And then the Venice Area Audubon Society, also an amazing place. They have a rookery and they also have bat houses. You may have come to one of my bat programs there. So that's a really unique place to visit too, especially when the birds are nesting, because you'll get to see all different types of species there along with their nests and their chicks. These are the sources I used today. Like I said, most of all of the information from this presentation did come from that All About Birds website, also from FWC for some of the imperiled species, and then the Audubon article that I talked about at the very beginning. So I want to thank you guys for joining me today. There's my email. I can also put it in the chat in a moment when I